Welcome to a special lecture on how neuroscience and public health can together be used to better inform theories of mental health counseling. The purpose of this recording is to make this content and information accessible to anybody who's interested in something that anyone beyond university students can engage with. To that end, we're joined today with some guests who will interrupt me with their questions and thoughts and comments as we go through the lecture.
I'm Zach. I'm Marianne's friend from Staten Island.
Yeah.
I live in Istanbul. I'm a computer programmer.
Hi, I'm Batseba. I'm a neuroscience student working with Marianne from Glasgow. Brand new to the whole thing, so learning as well. But yeah.
I'm Noah. I'm a writer and podcaster, and I am friends with Marianne from New York.
So today I'm talking about how neuroscience and public health can inform theories of mental health counseling. My background is really more in cognitive neuroscience. But I've been becoming increasingly more interested in things that are studied in public health and in sociology because it's becoming very clear to me that in order to understand human behavior, I really have to understand the environments that people live in before they come into my experiments, because their experiences until they came into my study are maybe going to influence how they act in my study. So, I think one of the first questions we ask ourselves when we try to understand why someone is afflicted with mental illness is what happened to them when they were a child, or what's their relationship with their parents. And I think that there's really good reason as to why this not only interests us, that we tell a lot of stories about it, we're interested in the media, but it's also really informative for us from a scientific perspective. And that's because unlike precocial animals who are born with the capability of movement and they're very self-sufficient at birth, us humans are altricial. And we're born quite immature, and we require care after birth in order to survive. So, because of this, attachment to our primary caregiver is a very adaptive survival strategy. And some scientists have gone on to theorize that the evolutionary pressure to attach to our caregiver is so strong that we will attach regardless of the quality of care. So even if your caregiver is violent or dangerous, we will continue to form an attachment to them. Okay. So, quality of care during early life is a very serious determinant of mental health in adulthood. So, we see here from a more recent meta-analysis that childhood abuse produces a 35% increase of self-harm into adulthood, which is a tremendous effect size.
So ducklings are they can take care of themselves right away because they seem hapless. They just look hapless. They don't look like they can take care of themselves.
Mm. Yeah, maybe I have to go and see if these are the best examples. They do
No, I
imprint
don't know.
all of
I'm thinking from like storybooks and they have the eggshell on their head and stuff. But maybe yeah, I don't know.
I think sea turtles are a really good example because their primary caregiver is like nowhere in sight. Like obviously they're still super vulnerable, right? And I think you tend to see that precocial animals, there's more of them, right? So that there's a greater chance of survival. And but they are better at fending for themselves than these ones, right? These ones depend on their caregiver and these ones don't.
Right.
Yeah, still vulnerable. Mhm. Okay. So in mice, we see pretty analogous outcomes. And though like the forced swim test isn't really a great measure of depression and it's fallen out of favor, this is maybe a little bit of an older study. But what you can see here
Also,
is
how do you
Mhm.
measure an abusive mother as a mouse?
Oh, I'm so glad that you asked that question. Can you hold on to that? Because there's going to be a
Okay.
lead into that.
Okay.
Okay. So in this paradigm, there's a control situation that's like a normal rearing. with mom and her pups. And then there's an abusive mother with her pups. And abuse here, so I won't give away too much, but abuse means that like she's being very rough with the pups. Like sometimes they like toss them around a little bit. They grab them from places that aren't the neck. Um, yeah, there's like kicking of them sometimes. I'll show more of that in a bit. So that's the paradigm of abuse. And then there's this other paradigm going on where the mother isn't abusive, but the pup is getting shocked, like electric shock, after they smell a certain smell. It's usually a wintergreen scent that they use. So what you see here is that pups that are experiencing basically early life trauma, whether it's by the mother or by some external event, are showing more immobility in the forced swim test, so they're freezing sooner. Um, and they are also less likely to show a social exploration. And this is later as adults. And abusive rearing also results in unstable hierarchies in this social ecosystem of mice. I'll come back to this as well in a little bit. But what we see is animals that have abusive rearing, when they're an adult, they are more aggressive, they're more depressed, they don't explore a lot. And what you see is if they are the dominant animal, they tend to fail to maintain their position and they don't really access the resources that they need as much because they're constantly fighting for status. And if they're the subordinate animal, they tend not to avoid the dominant one, so which means they're getting attacked more. And this looks like basically what they would call like an unstable hierarchy. And again, I'm going to come back to this. So keep those in mind. Okay, so we're interested in mice pups here, right? Because there's a lot more neuroscience done in them. But how do they really compare to a human baby, right? Um, there are some comparisons, right? They're both dependent upon the caregiver. They're both mammals, but there are obviously large differences here. And so, for one, like humans spend more time developing in the womb, and humans also don't really have as short of a period here as mice do, where they are very sensitive to attachment. Humans have a much more prolonged, kind of complex attachment um, period that is not well understood. So I'm going to highlight this in mice here because I'm going to separate out like a very explicit paradigm that's going to, I think, really elucidate why and how different types of early life trauma have lasting impacts into adulthood. And so here for mice, this period, so this just means like day 10 or something, right? So pups that are less than or equal to 9 days old here are in what's called a sensitive period. And this means that they are really dependent upon, I don't know if you could see this well, this like network here. They're using what we might call an attachment system to pretty much learn everything. And that's because their brains at this time are really set on attaching to the primary caregiver. So any other information is gonna get through this system as well. It's just what's happening. And so during
Sorry,
this
can I
period,
interrupt and just
yeah, go
ask a
ahead.
question?
Yeah.
So do rats, it's when you say primary caregiver, it's like the mother rat or like what's the
Yeah,
who
it's
raises the
in
rat?
this, it's just the mom alone with the pups. Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's no other social interaction. Mhm.
No rat daddies.
No dads. Like they're pretty controlled environments. Um, okay, so during this period, cortisol is very low. And when cortisol is low, there's this part of the brain called the amygdala. Have you all heard of the amygdala? I kind of like didn't explain it. Yeah, I feel like it's in society, right? As like synonymous with fear, right? Which is too simplified of an explanation for it. But we are going to talk about it in the context of fear learning here. So the rat pup's amygdalas are not well developed and they can't really activate here because cortisol levels are too low to allow amygdala dependent fear learning. Did you have a question, Zach?
No, I
Okay.
no. They talked about the amygdala in The Water Boy, the Adam Sandler movie.
Oh, did they?
Yeah,
Okay. So,
that's where I know it from.
yeah, I learned the word ornery from the water boy, which is also relevant to here because, yeah, early life trauma does make you more ornery. Okay, so here, odor shock conditioning can occur during this time. Um, well, it actually can occur, is what happens. You can try um, to stimulate this rat pup by like making them learn that this odor here, the mint, is going to precede a shock. You're trying to make them afraid of this smell, teach them that it causes something dangerous, and so teach them to acquire a fear, a learned fear. However, you cannot do it during this period at all. During this sensitive attachment period, because they don't have this fully developed threat learning network yet, it's going through this attachment network. Um, so essentially, what happens is even later in life, if you re-expose them to that mint smell, they approach it. So it's hurting them. But they never actually learn that it's dangerous because it's learned in this window in which they're learning to approach things that are associated with attachment and with mom. Does that make sense? Okay. So they will always approach it. In the next period, where they're slightly older here, amygdala circuitry has now developed. Okay. So when a pup is alone, you can teach them to avoid this smell here. And you do this basically when this happens, what happens is that the shock is going to activate their HPA axis. And this is basically your stress response system. And this releases cortisol, and that cortisol increase is necessary for the amygdala to be able to learn fear. Have you heard of the concept of allostatic load? No. Okay. So that's basically like across the lifespan, like all these stressors have accumulated, and it maybe has dysregulated this system here. And all of that through time has maybe increased your allostatic load. So you maybe be more chronically stressed if you've had higher instances of trauma throughout your lifespan than somebody who didn't. So when you hear about allostatic load, it's really talking about like the function of the HPA axis and how that might become dysregulated in different people who have different types of trauma or different levels of trauma. Okay. Also, yeah, so dysregulation in the HPA axis is really thought to produce long-term adaptations to stress responses, and it could underlie the development of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. So this circuitry here is basically your primary like neurobiology that's discussed when we're talking about the development of mental illness, especially depression, PTSD, anxiety. Okay. However, now, if the mom is present when you do this smell shock paradigm, now the baby actually cannot learn to avoid the smell. They learn to approach. And that's because the presence of the mom is going to actually act as a buffer to reduce the stress response and reduce the cortisol, but so much so that the baby actually is incapable of learning this. They regress kind of into that sensitive period again. And now they would learn to approach that winter scent, even into adulthood. Okay. And then finally, the baby has entered this period of where they have adult threat-related circuitry, and they can learn to withdraw from the wintergreen scent, regardless of whether the mother is present. For humans, I don't think we know exactly the parallels, but it's roughly maybe between 9 and 11 years old.
Can I ask again just to go over
Yeah.
that? So if there's no mother present, they
Yeah.
don't develop they don't develop a fear of the scent, or they do develop a fear of the scent. And
Okay.
sorry,
No, no, it's totally fine. I
I
think
think I
this gets
misunderstood.
confusing.
If the mother is present there because the mother comforts them, they're not afraid of the mint scent because the mother's there?
Yes, exactly. Right?
Okay.
So when they're very, very young, it doesn't matter who's present. They only have the attachment system, so they can't learn to fear they will always approach the dangerous thing. Here,
Okay.
when they're a little bit older in this like transitional period, they can learn it if they're alone, but if their mom is present, the mom buffers their stress and they can no longer learn it. Once they're
Oh,
like
that
in this
seems
adult
complicated.
period, now it doesn't matter if mom's present or not, they could still independently learn this threat response and they can appropriately withdraw from it. Good?
Okay.
Got it?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
sort of. It seems yeah.
It is. Okay, yeah. No, it is
It's complicated because
complicated.
it's so the mother not being there is bad in the beginning, but then would be better when they're a little older, and
Yeah,
then
no, this is actually why things get
I don't know.
so tricky, right? Like, yeah, I mean, so basically, this is why essentially, I'm not talking about adult trauma here, which an adult trauma is like super important too for mental health, and it's absolutely like important and it has an effect on people beyond their control. However, like early life trauma is so much stickier and complex because of these developmental window quirks, right? Because you can actually be learning to approach something that's dangerous. So you can imagine that this could extend potentially to explain things. I might just skip to this side. Here, why early life trauma has such a prolonged impact, why it's harder to change it, why it's like really lasting with us, and also maybe why there's this very complicated approach behavior associated with things that are like attachment abuse, which you might see in like different interpersonal relationships, because a lot of different experiences from early in life, like, well, and later in life will trigger like the context of early life experiences. And we learn as children how to access care, right? So when we end up in relationships or in situations where we need to access care again, we start mimicking the behaviors and the feelings and the expectations that we had when we were children. And we can learn to update them, but those things are so laid out, like so well grounded. And so, yeah, like intermixed with our threat contingencies and other things and not as easily accessed through the ways we as adults like change memories or think about things, right? Where we use language and stuff, like it was laid out before language. And they're sort of like conceptually isolated, yet really prevalent and really, really influencing us. So you can imagine when you seek healthcare and when you are in a romantic relationship, you are triggering that early life environment and you might reenact some things that might be good or bad that you learned during that time. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
It makes sense. I'm
Yeah.
just I guess to cut to the chase, I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. So which
Yeah.
one should I be neglecting and which one should I be giving attention to right now? Just to
Well,
like maximize like where they are developmentally.
I don't think I have an answer to that one.
Okay.
But it might be more along the lines of it might be that Eichner is more impactful than you though, but I'm sure both really matter. Yeah.
All right, then it's her problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's so many other things to disentangle too, because then stress in the mother, like because cortisol in the mom's body will get into the baby's body, during development. We're not even talking about fetal development, and also through breast milk. And cortisol not only is something that's mediating this threat circuitry, but cortisol is also something that can alter gene activation, right? So if you ever have you heard of fetal programming? And it sounds scarier than it is. It's a natural thing that happens. Like now that with AI, it sounds like something that you would do. It's a summary of these studies that look at like how really serious traumas in mothers alter the gene expression of their young. So for example, they studied mothers of the Holocaust, that mothers that survived the Holocaust, right? Their babies are more likely to develop anxiety disorders, PTSD, and depression later in life. Same thing. I mean, it's not just like with this gene activation that changes your proclivity towards like higher stress responses or hypervigilance, which you can imagine is adaptive. If your mother grew up in a really traumatic environment, like the mother's preparing the baby to survive a traumatic environment, right? So that's why these stress systems are getting activated. Likewise, like starvation is a huge one for changing gene activation because you're preparing the next generation to enter a food insecure environment. And that changes a whole load of systems in the body, right? In ways we still don't completely understand. And it lasts for several generations. Okay, so let's get back to Noah's question. How would you make a mother abusive? Do you have any, what are your guys' guesses?
You make it
Um,
like a resource scarce environment.
Yes, Noah's got it. It's like it's exactly it. I think this is actually just completely phenomenal. And I like kind of want to sit with it for a second. But here you have in this very controlled animal study, you have mice that are 99.9%, like they're genetically identical, right? They are in the exact same environment. So there's no differences in wind and air pollution and water and light and et cetera, temperature, noise. Everything is exactly the same. The only thing that changes here is that they don't give one mother sufficient bedding to build her nest. That is the only thing that changes. This mother cannot access the bedding that she needs to make a proper nest. And when that happens, we see this is the low bedding condition, rough handling. So, like I was saying, kind of like picking them up at places that aren't the nape, being really rough with them, stepping on them. The pups make more vocalizations, so they might be crying for their mom or maybe they're irritated. This is the kicking behavior. So, you see a strong increase in the mom kicking them. And here you can really see what's going on. So this is a control mom with sufficient bedding, and this is the nest here that she made. This is these lines are where they walk around like throughout a 24-hour period. This is the mother with insufficient bedding and where she's walking around. And you see she's just so frustrated pacing around everywhere. So she might be searching for bedding. Basically, what's going on is like they have a biological drive to create a nest. And she's trying to build a nest and it's failing because there's not enough bedding. She can't produce it. So she's trying over and over and over again. And so she's getting frustrated. I mean, you can imagine there might be, I don't know if they study this, but there's probably like sleep problems too. She's probably not resting properly. Cortisol's increasing in the mom, right? So just this one small thing in the environment changes all of this, right? I think that's really intense. And I think that that shows like a really strong parallel to things that we see in human society, where here we know that no matter where you are, people who have the lowest incomes are 1.5 to 3 times more likely than their wealthy counterparts to experience depression or anxiety. And this is true for so many things beyond depression and anxiety, like life expectancy drops, right? Heart disease, chronic pain, like you name it. Um, and so there's been a lot of pushback on whether this is causal. Um, and still, this paper tried to put together a really strong argument for causality, and we're going to discuss some of those things. And I think it is a very strong argument, but proving causality in epidemiology is a challenge. Yeah. And so this is the model that they put forth. And they say it's causal, and they also say it's bidirectional, which I would be curious on anyone's opinions on that. So they're saying that poverty will increase worry, change your physical health, changes the early life conditions like we're discussing, maybe exposes you to more violence and crime, alters your social status, and that will influence mood anxiety. And then if you do end up acquiring an anxiety disorder or depression, that then is going to alter your economic capacity so that it might make you more inclined to either stay in poverty or to fall into poverty. So you might lose your job, experience more unemployment, maybe not advocate for yourself as much, etc. So they consider it very cyclical. Does anybody have thoughts on that?
I mean, it
I,
sounds correct to me. It doesn't, yeah.
yeah, I think it is. because poverty is a pre-existing condition, right? But I think that it's not like that there is like the fundamental cause is poverty, like is that we have an economic system that allows for poverty, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't, yeah, I haven't experienced like, I mean, I've been broke, but it's different than being impoverished.
Yeah.
Um, Being broke is stressful
Yeah.
and certainly leads to like negative things that I've done. Um, but yeah, it sounds correct to me.
Yeah. There's going to be more data that kind of gets at probably closer to like your experience as well. So
Fine.
yeah, we can stick a pin in that. So for causal evidence, I'm going to summarize some animal stuff and then get into like the data in humans. Um, this is one study that I point to a lot when I'm talking about pain, which I'm not talking about now. But here they have what they call a regular cage, which I put quotes around because to me, this is deprivation. And then they have what they call an enriched cage. And so in the regular cage, a mouse is alone. They have restricted food and water time. Um, they have bedding, but they don't have any toys. They don't have like housing structures to hide under. Mice don't like to be exposed to the open environment because that's usually how they're preyed upon. So to me, this is a deprived condition, in my opinion, because mice are social, so they're socially isolated. They are don't have a way to hide when they want to hide, like they lack shelter basically. And they don't have the autonomy to get food and water. Um, in the enriched cage, they have unlimited food and water. They live in a group of five and they're all like friends. There's like housing structures to hide under and to play in, and there's other things like tunnels and there's exercise wheels and stuff. So there's novelty toys, etc. Okay, so the only difference here now in these mice are that they live in these different environments. And now what they do is they take one from each cage and they give them something called a chronic restriction injury. They create nerve damage in the paw or in the leg. And they see if the animal goes on to develop what looks like neuropathic or chronic pain. And so what they find is that the enriched cage actually blunts the development of what looks like chronic pain. So they have less pain responses when they're in the enriched cage, which means that paw licking less, like they look like they're in less pain and tending to themselves less. They have less depression-like phenotypes, which are, a little bit difficult to determine in mice, but it's like the freezing behavior, withdrawing socially, things like that. Less memory deficits, less neurogenesis. Neurogenesis is the birth of new neurons. Less deficits to neurogenesis. So if they're in the regular cage and they have the injury, they're less likely to produce new neurons. They're basically their brain health is being stunted, and they're less likely to form lasting memories. Um, and there's more inflammation if they're in the regular cage in their hippocampus, which is an area of the brain that's really important for memory. Okay. It's also important in the stress response. Usually, when you have like a lot of cortisol in your system, you see physical changes to the amygdala and the hippocampus. They tend to actually shrink in size. Okay. Doing okay? Okay.
Yeah, no, it's good. Despite all my rage, I'm in an enriched cage. So
Thank you.
I'm doing a little
Okay.
better.
So, for those animals now that experience abusive rearing, this is just a callback to earlier that unstable hierarchy versus ones that have typical rearing. They might enter still into a hierarchy, but it's a stable hierarchy. What we see here is unstable hierarchies across the animal kingdom tend to be more stressful environments. And we have data now that social rank essentially yields very distinct physiological profiles. And it's possibly due to higher like allostatic load and higher chronic cortisol release essentially in animals and people who are increasingly stressed out, usually from subordination. Um, so how do we know that subordination yields this profile of like reduced neuroplasticity, reduce immune, like there's immune suppression. You have a greater hypertension, greater stress responses. Your adrenal glands are working more. There's deficits to sexual reproduction. How do we know that it's the rank that determines the physiology and not the physiology that determines your rank? Does anyone have a guess?
Rank
I'm
determines
not.
rank determines physiology.
Yes. How would we determine that?
What is rank? Like
Rank would
rank
mean like
in the hierarchy of the mice?
yeah, it could be mice. It could be any like a lot of this is done in monkeys. So the alpha versus, the beta. Like
Okay.
yeah, so the alpha male tends to be the one that gets to eat first. So there's also very different structures too in different types of animals. So first I'll just answer the other question, and it's because in controlled animal studies, they'll have a socially isolated animal assess its physiological profile, then introduce it to a community and see where its rank is. And the physiology that they have at time point one does not determine what rank they get, but once they have a rank, they get a physiological profile that matches like what we already know, right? So it's the rank that's developing the physiological profile. Um, Also, like hierarchies don't always have to be bad, and the subordinate, the lower rank one doesn't always have to be the one that is stressed out. So in hierarchical structures like wolf packs, right? It's a bit more like a family structure where the alpha is being more protective a lot of the time. Like there's still dominance, but there isn't always like a there isn't the same amount of like beating on the lower ones, right? It's usually like they absorb a bit more of the hypervigilance of protecting the pack, of like of getting the food, of acquiring things. So you might see actually more stress in a hierarchical system where the one at the top is like a protector, right? Versus in a hierarchical system where the one at the top is like maybe maintaining it by abuse and violence, and there's a lot of fighting going on. If there's a lot of fighting, it might become unstable and it's bad for everybody, especially the ones at the bottom. If it's stable and the top one is being very abusive, then you see the stressful rank in the lower ranks. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so that's basically what I said, so I'll just skip that. And the other causal evidence we have in humans comes from studies of economic shocks. And so this is actually something, Noah, I think that you might know a lot about. So for one, we know across many studies, but I just pulled out this one from India that's specifically in farmers. Debt is a really strong predictor of suicide. We see this over and over again. The amount of indebtedness someone has really affects their mental health.
Well,
Um,
also like
mhm.
debt for like a farmer is like can be like an existential thing, like rather quickly. And in the US, like probably the most striking contemporary analog was a rash of suicides among taxi drivers in the 2010s who had taken out huge loans to get medallions that because of Uber and Lyft and other rideshare companies, the value of those medallions had plummeted tremendously. And so there were like a spate of public suicides among taxi drivers that are sort of like it's anecdotal. Like I don't know if there has been any like, like serious like socio-medical study of the phenomenon,
Yeah.
but it's surely the one I recall most recently that sort of like speaks to the relationship between that specific like, situation of extreme personal indebtedness and an extreme outcome, suicide.
Yeah. Thank you. Here is in Indonesia. And so they knew that during times of drought that there is an increase in farmer suicide because of debt, right? And financial reasons during the drought. Um, and so they tried this cash transfer program, and this becomes a common paradigm. that the New York Times wrote a very awful article about like a year ago that drove me up a wall. But cash transfers basically are studies in which they literally give cash to people, and maybe there's a control group that doesn't, or they like will administer it at different time points sort of randomly across people so they can try to infer causality by like time locking it, if that makes sense, time locking the manipulation. And so I'm not sure exactly how much money they give here, but that is important. The amount of money in a cash transfer is important. I'm digressing a little, but the New York Times picked one cash transfer study and produced this whole argument that they fail because this one cash transfer study in the United States in a major city gave $300 once to a mother and it didn't actually change much. It's like 300. Okay, it's like not enough money. Um, and that they wrote this whole thing just based on that one study when there's so much evidence from other cash transfer studies that they actually do make sense and change things. So these farmers here during the drought, if they get a if they get a cash transfer during a drought that prevents them from going into debt, you see a reduction in suicide. Whereas here, if you just gave them a cash transfer and there wasn't a drought, so there was no economic need for it, there isn't really an effect on it. And then this control here is just the average effect across different areas where there weren't droughts. Average suicide rates. Does that make sense? So still, because like it's very hard to do something causal at this level, like it is difficult to make causal arguments, but this is getting very close. And here's some other economic shock studies. That I thought are interesting. Here was looking at factory closures in Austria. You saw that there was an increase in antidepressant use, specifically by the people who were affected by the closures and mental health related hospitalization. And then this one I thought was interesting. I thought, Noah, maybe you might have some ideas on this, but that there's different counties in the US that were exposed to trade liberalization with China, saw reduced employment and income for certain workers and increased mortality and drug overdose in a specific group. I don't know. Do you know what that?
Yeah, I mean, that's just like deindustrialization by another, word. So it's like, or phrase. So like, take the phenomena, think of like the Rust Belt, sort of the canonical place of this. And this is a phenomenon that like precedes China, to be clear, the China shock. Um,
Oh,
but just because like we began deindustrializing really in the 60s and then it picked up in the 70s and 80s. But yeah, I mean, this is how places like the Rust Belt came to be and what characterized that when the U.S. shifted from being an export, or a shift from having, or when mass industrial employment and exporting it to then being a country that imports and liberalizing trade laws that way, making it easier for foreign imports to come in. Um, it's not suggesting that the cause is like trade liberalization because it's more multi-factor, but it's
yeah,
showing that in communities that where there was high industrial employment, that they were very exposed
yeah,
to these changing economic conditions, and that they were more likely, like the rapid change in economic circumstance is more likely to produce, as it says there, increased mortality and drug overdose, etc.
yeah,
Like it's not a coincidence, right, that like the opioid abuse capital of the United States is in a place that was sort of like twice deindustrialized, first after mining left in like West Virginia, and then again after like what factory work there was began, getting further and further away.
yeah. Interesting. I think it's interesting too that I feel, maybe you all have like a feeling on this too, that when something like an economic shock happens, there's a sense in the general population and maybe also in policy developers that it's like almost like a random weather event. It's like, oh, this terrible thing happened and people did die because of it or were affected by it, but it's like a hurricane. We couldn't possibly have prevented it, or we couldn't have possibly have really like predicted it. But in reality, it's not the case. It's really a deliberate choice and a deliberate policy. And we have so much evidence now about how economic changes and especially like taking jobs away from people influences health that it's not random. And And it feels like it could be classified at some legal level as as an assault. Like, I don't know. Do you
Yeah,
have
because I
opinions
think
on
it all makes
that?
sense, and you'd kind of hope that it is common sense. Like, if you take someone's job away, they're not going to be doing too good because, like, you're taking away like their income, their livelihood. You're taking away the way that they support their family. Sometimes, like, people's status as well, and like how they see themselves, like how they see their self-worth because we live in such a capitalist society now, which isn't too great. And I think like now our most like recent example is like post-COVID with the cost of living crisis. I know that's something that's hit the UK really, really bad to the point that like people's lives are just not the same as it was pre-COVID. So I
Mhm.
think it's just what you were saying about like how it kind of looks like a random weather event, but it's not. It's something I don't think has changed even in the past few years. Like it's just
Mhm.
get worse at some points.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because we can maybe we could perceive COVID as random, but then all the other things that happened during COVID aren't, right?
Yeah. And all the
Yeah.
things that happened after as well, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there is all this evidence. It's just a summary. I'm not going to go into detail here, but there's basically very consistent positive effects on mental health as a result of cash transfers and these anti-poverty programs that are have a lot of different things going on in different studies. So there is evidence that these work. Um, However, before we get into like why aren't they being implemented at a grand scale, it's still not the whole story here. Like cash transfers and these anti-poverty programs alone might not be enough. So for one, there's this effect that seems paradoxical, but we will explain it in a second. The richer countries have more mental illness. So here, the richer a country is, the greater levels of depression and anxiety. Um, what do you think explains that? Does anyone have a guess?
Modern society has like more opportunities for people to lose status, and that like what characterizes like a richer country typically is also like greater inequality
Yes.
and social mobility, and that's like what this chart necessarily reflects because yeah, like there are those surveys that routinely show that like poor countries are incredibly happy, and obviously what that should tell somebody is like, yeah, that happiness is a flawed measurement. And then the same way that like a direct correlation between like rich and like mental well-being is also like kind of a flawed direct association.
Yes. That's
I would
exactly.
say,
Yeah.
I
Sorry.
mean, just living in, I live in a country, like a middle developing country. I'm not quite developing, but there's less diagnosis of these things here. People are not being diagnosed with these things uh,
Mhm.
probably at the same rate that they are in Western countries.
That's probably
So,
wonderful.
how do you measure it?
Yeah. No, I think that's an important one. So, one element to that, I think that's very true for mental health. And maybe it's true for other disorders, but you can find this same effect for infant mortality and mortality rates in general, which are definitely statistics, and it doesn't matter if you went to the hospital or not, right? So these you do see these same effects. But I do agree that's probably true to some degree, but it doesn't explain it all. Did you want to say something, Bathsheba? I'm not sure. Sorry.
I was gonna say like I think I this kind of makes sense now because like so much of like it is like go to work, do your work alone, and then after work, you're probably going to think about work and it kind of just lingers with you. And so much of your time is either spent at work or getting ready to go to work or coming home from work and preparing. So I think like that kind of becomes people's like full lives now rather than just a part of it.
That's such a good one, and not something that I have in this talk, but I was thinking about it. This is a digression. I started reading this book, if you could see it. It's The Politics of the Mind by Ian Ferguson. Um, I think that the cover is like a little silly, but the text like that, I was like actually really excited about this. I thought it was like it's really well done. But he was addressing similar stuff to what you're saying. And he's like very specific to the UK, and he was talking about how like the I think, and maybe you can correct me on this too, but one of the only accessible or mental health programs in the NHS is cognitive behavioral therapy. Is that
Yeah,
correct? Yeah.
that's the main. Yeah.
Yeah. And he was saying that, I mean, there, and as someone who's in like neuroscience and stuff, like and psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy does have the highest effect sizes for improving people's mental health, but he adds this element to it where he's like, well, the outcome that they're usually measuring is going back to work, you know? And so this program being deployed in the healthcare system and being the only one available is really about just getting people back in the workforce. And is that actually a really complete treatment of someone? And could like this tie to the workforce to your labor be a part of something that alters your mental health? Yeah.
Yeah, because productivity is like such a measure now, and it's kind of like if you've got great productivity, your life is great now. Like that's how it's seen. So I think that's a really good perspective you put in there.
Yeah. Yeah. He started making a case for psychoanalysis, but he was like very specific on the types. I haven't finished the book, so but very, yeah, super interesting. Um, but yeah, so basically everyone's saying really important points. Noah's point was the one that this figure illustrates, which is, and this comes from a lot of Richard Wilkinson's work, essentially that basically you name it, any sort of health inequity is correlated with the amount of inequality in a nation. So here the USA is leading as being the highest in inequality among these relative countries and the greatest levels of mental illness. Um, and one of the things he says is it now looks as if the major part of the association between low social status and poor health springs from the experience of social status or subordination itself. And I find this quote really interesting as a cognitive scientist because of the word experience. Like it's the experience of something. That means that we are learning something and then we're using that learning later. And that's where I think cognitive science is really important for shedding some explanation here. Um, so yeah, so how would we use the brain to help explain some of these things? There's a theory called predictive coding, and it essentially says, here's a quote from Carl Friston, the anatomy of any system has to contain a model of the environment within that system is immersed. And I'll explain this in more detail, but it just says that we don't experience the world one to one with sensory stimuli. We experience our expectations of sensory stimuli. And that can happen at many different levels. So our expectations can be as simple as I expect not to have a blind spot in my vision, you know, I expect to have consistency in visual input. So my brain is constantly filling in visual information where it can't actually access photons, where the blind spot is from where my eye is attached to the optic nerve, right? There's no light that shines there. So constantly we are using predictions about our world to shape our experience. Um, and you can imagine that could be happening at a much higher level. So here, I just thought these are two interesting examples. Here's like barriers to healthcare, that example. And here's something analogous too, because this is also a barrier to care. If you need help from your primary caregiver, it's a similar thing. You're in a vulnerable state and you have to go seek care, but someone is not listening to you, you know? Um, I think it's a very important shaping on the social determinants of health, and it's one that I think um, becomes maybe sometimes even more important than like financial. I think financial access is incredibly important. You know, like there's a huge part. But I think maybe some of the reasons why you can see these differences in like the NHS where everything is free is that it doesn't always necessarily mean that every individual is going to be believed or treated the same way. Okay. So this is just an example of the predictive coding. So basically saying when we see something, we might not just be representing like the edges and the colors of the stimulus. We are also feeling something about it. We have ideas about how we might use it. We have ideas of whether we like it or don't like it and how it might impact us. And these are predictions that we make based off of what we've learned. So we might have observed someone else with some object, or we might have used it ourselves, or maybe we use an approximate other object to make an assumption about this new one, right? And all these theories, grounded cognition, predictive coding, affective gist, are basically saying the same thing, that it's possible that perceptual input, as it moves through, comes in through the eye and it's going through this is more deep, the LGN in the brain, it's not in the cortex, but now it gets into the cortex right here at V1, as it's moving through all these layers of cortex here, that the features that we think V1 is representing very elementary, like orientation of lines, and maybe as it moves up, you're seeing the representation of edges, and you're working towards building a full visual stimulus. But it's possible maybe even these basic elementary features deep down, even in V1, are being convolved with beliefs that are related to even the value and expectations of what you might do with this thing, the actions you can take with it. So that your full perceptual representation of your world is always intermixed with your expectations for how it will help or harm you and what you can do, what actions you can take with it. Does that make sense? Yep.
Yeah, is that spinach?
I hope so because I've used this in a lot of talks just because I forget why it was like a convenient image to edit. And I like put that an action you could take is eat it. So, yeah.
It looks
So,
good.
yeah, hopefully it is spinach. This is an example. We don't have to go in detail here, but like how these like predictions and then the actual experience or the actual input might resolve errors each time so that you can update learning. Usually we learn when something is unexpected. If something happens that is perfectly within your expectations, it doesn't even have to register because it doesn't have to update your model of the world. One reason why PTSD could be so difficult to modify and so traumatic, like the definition of trauma maybe lie in this, in which that there was something that happened that was so outside your realm of expectations, your model of the world, but so serious and so life-threatening that you missing a piece of information or missing that prediction is so costly to you that your brain is now maybe having to massively reweight so many other expectations. And maybe that's a part of the reason why PTSD is like so all encompassing and gets into other memories. Okay. So yeah, so the idea here is that this affective coloring, your feeling, your orientation to things, which, is a healthy brain does, but maybe could look like poor mental health, right? If you're constantly coloring it with depression and sadness, um, are part of the meaning that we imbue a stimulus that is emerging from all this recurrent activity in your brain. And I think all of this goes to say, that our affective experience being constructed by these neural predictions, that means that we have predictions about our economic environment and our status and our social role, and that we might actually be feeling them, right? And so that makes like cartoons like this um, more than a metaphor. Okay, I know we're getting a little bit over time, but we are almost at the end. There's a speech here that was given by Vicente Navarro at this WHO Commission in 2008 on what we mean by the social determinants of health. And it's excellent. It's actually the speech where I first learned about inequality in Glasgow. He talks about how just like between two neighborhoods, you can see the life expectancy drop by 28 years. And he cites these kinds of effects across the globe. Um, and one of the takeaways from that is he says that the conditions in which people live and die are in turn shaped by political, social, and economic forces. And through a lot of, I think, the push from him and others, the WHO put out these principles of action in 2008, which clearly haven't really been taken place. But these are the ways that they said that that we would help improve mental health and health in general. And that was improve conditions of daily life, the circumstances in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age, tackle the inequitable distribution of power, money, and resources, the structural drivers of those conditions of daily life, globally, nationally, and locally, measure the problem, evaluate action, expand the knowledge base, and develop a workforce that is trained in the social determinants of health, and raise public awareness about the social determinants of health. This is the full model. I'm gonna just kind of move through it and just like give it to you if you want to look at it later. But yeah, so here's my like final plea. I usually give this more to cognitive neuroscientists, of why the consideration of societal conditions is important in basically every study we ever do, but particularly anything that has to do with emotion or subjective experience. Um, so, this image comes from a talk by David Krakauer, who is a complexity scientist, and so it's really designed to teach or give you an intuition for complexity theory and the idea of emergence. But I'm going to relate it to the brain. It's basically what I think we can think of subjective experience as something that is emerging from um, brain activity. So here's subjective experience like your affective behavior, and it might emerge from brain activity like we were looking before in the predictive coding. Um, and that brain activity might emerge from brain structure. And brain structure might be emerging from genetic code, right? And you can go lower and you can also go higher than affective behavior, probably. Um, but okay, so here, when we study something, and usually cognitive scientists are studying things right here, if we pick a level to study, if that level is sufficiently emergent, then that's the only level you need to know in order to understand its future development. Any given level is necessary and sufficient to predict its own future. So basically, that means a psychiatrist, for example, just needs to understand a person's behavior, which might be up here. They don't need to know anything about brain activity. They don't need to know anything about brain structure to treat their patient. That is what this is saying, right? So for example, if you want to understand something like this AI program AlphaGo, and this is an AI that beats humans at this game Go, so it's pretty sophisticated, you would watch the state of the board to try and predict the outcome of the game. And that's because AlphaGo at its highest level is a game of strategy. Right? So you'd be studying this level, and that would be all you would need to understand basically what the next move of AlphaGo would be. You would not have to understand the software. Basically, you wouldn't have to know what language it was programmed in. You don't have to know exactly how many for loops, etc. You wouldn't have to know anything about the hardware. You don't have to know how a GPU works, etc. You just need to know this, like the state of the board and how to play the game. However, so now you're going to imagine in this example that if I turn the heat up in the room so high that now AlphaGo maybe starts to make pathological moves or moves that can't be explained by the state of the board because we melted its GPU. So now it's basically there's a bug at the hardware level that's producing erratic behavior, right? And at that stage, then the board is no longer sufficient to understand the behavior. Okay. And so at that stage, we could think of that as if somebody had like a real neurological disorder that altered their behavior, right? And so what I want to convey with this example is that we often stay at the level of software or strategy without looking at the state of the board, okay? We're often like studying people here or studying people here, but we don't actually look at the state of the board in which they live in, the socioeconomic conditions that they live in before they come into our study. So we don't know what their like trained model is in their daily life, right? That explains their behavior in their real world. Um, Likewise, so if we do that, if we never make an attempt to understand behavior from the outside, from the state of the board, as well as from the brain, then we're going to never know if the manifestations of affect that we're studying, like depression or chronic pain or anxiety, are the result of strategy or pathology, right? So the other end of that is that we tend to really reduce to neurobiology a lot of the time, that we treat depression and anxiety as something that can be cured only with a pharmaceutical drug or maybe with deep brain stimulation. And if we do that, we're completely avoiding understanding the economic conditions that might have shaped what is a healthy brain that might have learned a disordered environment. Does that make sense? I don't know if I said that clearly, but so the answer is we have to study both because there can be actual pathology, right? There are disorders that probably have really strong genetic or like hardware issues, right? Like a seizure. But there are also things that may look like pathology that might actually be a learned behavior that is adaptive, unfortunately, to a system that is not adaptive. Um, and so to end that, this is a quote by Rudolf Virchow, who is somebody that really shaped the way I think about this. He says, medicine is a social science and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale. Medicine as a social science, as the science of human beings, as the obligation to point out problems and to attempt their theoretical solution. The politician, the practical anthropologist must find the means for their actual solution. He started a whole movement during this time in the late 1800s in which he was telling medical doctors, are we treating our patients? Are we actually curing our patients if we only give them a drug and then they go back out into an environment that has made them sick? So, for example, if there was really poor sanitation or overcrowding, like if our patient's going to just go back out there and acquire it again, have we really done our jobs? And he was so radical in doing that, he was actually exiled by the government. And finally, I tried to find like the earliest people who were discussing this on record. And this is the oldest I can find, but this is another physician. This is in France, Cabanis. He wrote The Diseases Depend on the Mistakes of Society. He was commenting on how lack of proper sanitation in France was making people ill when they didn't necessarily need to be ill, right? So he started a whole movement to actually improve sanitation, to improve the health and well-being of people in France.
I was really intrigued by the way Krakauer phrased the problem
Mm,
as like the different like layers of transmission for
yeah.
like how something is programmed, but then the difference in pathology versus what was it? Uh
Strategy.
Yes, exactly. Like, and the idea, like, and how, like, the idea of using like the metaphor of a thermometer of a thermostat in the room breaking and messing with the chip in
Mhm.
the thing. I thought that was really interesting, and also strategy as being a measure of like how you play the rules of the game, and like
Yeah.
that's how we know what outcome. Like that's how we measure outcomes
Yeah.
because like there's this normative determination about like what victory is to win the game that
Yeah.
we obtain that we treat as an objective reality against which we measure performance. And that to me was like, oh, that is kind of like a helpful way to frame this and like how it is that we're like measuring or how like you're articulating like what a standard is and why like certain health outcomes don't measure up to that standard.
There is I think, a false intuition that the further down you go in science, the smarter you are, right? So that if you are determining the neurobiological circuit of something, that you must be much smarter than a psychiatrist or somebody studying behavior, right? Or a social scientist or a sociologist, right? There's this feeling that if you go all the way down to the level of physics, that then you're the genius, right? And I think it's like it's not that all these things are hard in different ways, but if we consider this framework, the further, like the more emergent it is, the harder it is to understand because it actually requires you to keep going back. Like you have to understand more, you know? And there's so many different parts, and it's so much harder to measure. So it's a much more complicated, sophisticated problem. And I think sometimes that we reduce things to neurobiological circuits or to just a pharmaceutical answer because we're being lazy, because we don't want to grapple with like actually how difficult of a problem it is.
Yeah, it's I mean, I like the metaphor for the computer because of course, computers are layers of abstraction. You have like the actual transistors sending electrical signals and stacking electrical signals. Then you have software at a very like operating system level interpreting it, and then you have a higher level software, you know, managing what the operating system is doing. But it's yeah, it's kind of a lot more complicated than that, right? Because there's no clean break between the layers
Yeah.
here in the brain. It's more fuzzy and it's harder to there's no abstractions that you can like cleanly break between the software hardware strategy layer.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Even like when we lay out those nice circuits of like the attachment circuit and the thread circuit, it's definitely not as simple as that either. Like those circuits don't exist in isolation. There's still the rest of the brain, right? That is doing something and interacting with that circuit with some level, right? Like maybe you could explain more variance with that circuit and it's driving a lot of things.
I just want to, I just want to go, I want to go to a pet store and buy a little rat and just take care of it and pet it. And that's my big takeaway from this. I just want the little rat to feel safe.
Wait, do
Okay.
you have any comments, Betsy?
I was just gonna say I like how like the reason I don't have a lot of questions is because you laid it all out like really well and like anytime I had a question you answered it like straight after anyway somehow like some sort of mind
Cool.
reading thing I don't know but yeah it was just a really good lecture and I think it was just a really interesting way to like get a different perspective on this and I like a lot what you were saying so yeah.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, if you have any ideas on like making it better or refining it, I'm gonna give it on Monday, so feel free to email me or anything.